For the soldiers of the German army, the drone of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a familiar and reassuring sound. For the first few years of the war, it was the sound of dominance, of their own hunters patrolling the skies. But war has a way of changing things. By 1944, a new noise started to fill the air over Europe. It wasn't elegant. It didn't whistle or scream. It roared. It thundered with a deep, guttural, almost clumsy rumble. When the aircraft that made it first appeared, German pilots laughed. They called it names like the Fliegende Milchkrug, the flying milk bottle or flying milk jug. To them, it was a fat, oversized American experiment, a clumsy giant in a sky that belonged to nimble predators. They were about to learn. This wasn't the sound of a joke. This was the sound of their own destruction. It was the sound of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Section 1. The Mockery, the Flying Milk Bottle. In early 1943, the skies over occupied Europe were a deadly arena dominated by the German Luftwaffe. Their fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were sharp, agile, and deadly, flown by aces who had been fighting for years. They knew what a real fighter plane was supposed to look and sound like. And then, this thing arrived, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was met with confusion and mockery. Even American pilots, many trained on the nimble British Spitfire, were skeptical. The Thunderbolt felt heavy and sluggish in a turn. Its own pilots nicknamed it the Jug, which many assume was short for Juggernaut, but was more likely a direct jab at its milk jug-like shape. It was, by any measure, a monster. With a maximum takeoff weight approaching 8 tons, or 7,500 pounds, it was nearly twice as heavy as a Focke-Wulf 190. To Luftwaffe pilots, it was a caricature of a fighter, a testament to what they saw as crude American engineering. Just build it bigger and hope for the best. They saw a giant, slow-climbing target. And at first, they seemed tragically right. The P-47's combat debut with the U.S. 8th Air Force in April 1943 was a disaster. Its early radios were notoriously unreliable at high altitudes, leaving entire squadrons blind and deaf. Its climb rate was, to put it mildly, abysmal. A Bf 109 could practically run circles around it on the way up. German pilots quickly learned to exploit these weaknesses. Their tactics were simple: avoid a high-speed chase and lure the big American into a low-altitude turning fight, where its weight was a fatal flaw. The laughter in Luftwaffe mess halls grew louder. The flying milk bottle was confirming all their biases. Even the men tasked with leading the Thunderbolt into battle had doubts. Colonel Hubert Hub-Zemke, the brilliant commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was not impressed when he first saw the aircraft. His young pilots struggled with it, and the lead-up to combat was marked by tragedy. The group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents before they ever saw an enemy. The pressure was immense. The American bomber offensive was bleeding men and machines over Germany, and they desperately needed an escort fighter. The P-47 looked like a very expensive, very heavy mistake. The Germans had every reason to be confident. They had fought the plane, and they had won. They understood its limitations perfectly, but they completely failed to comprehend the monster hiding inside the machine. They laughed at the bottle, unaware it was filled with thunder. Section 2. The Unseen Power, the Monster Within. To understand the Thunderbolt, you have to understand the man who created it. Alexander Kartveli. A brilliant Georgian immigrant who had fled the Bolsheviks, Kartveli was the head of engineering at Republic Aviation. In June 1940, with Germany steamrolling across Europe, he was summoned to Wright Field in Ohio. The U.S. Army Air Corps' message was blunt. Everything they had was inadequate. They needed a new fighter with a top speed of at least 400 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 40,000 feet, and no less than 8 machine guns. On the train ride back to New York, Kartveli sketched a design so radical it defied all conventional wisdom. He later reportedly said, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The dinosaur's heart was the most powerful piston engine in the world, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. The R2800 was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine that initially produced a staggering 2,000 horsepower. But it wasn't just powerful, it was tough. Unlike the sleek, liquid-cooled engines in the Spitfire and Bf 109, which could be knocked out by a single shot to their cooling systems, the air-cooled R2800 didn't have that vulnerability. It could sustain incredible damage. Entire cylinders could be shot away and still somehow keep running, dragging its pilot home. But high-altitude performance was the real challenge. Kartveli's solution was revolutionary. He designed the entire aircraft around a General Electric turbo supercharger, a complex device that used the engine's own hot exhaust gases. These gases were channeled through a sprawling network of ducts down the plane's belly to the turbo in the rear fuselage. The turbine would spin at over 20,000 RPM, forcing compressed, oxygen-rich air all the way back to the engine. This intricate loop of power is what gave the P-47 its deep belly and massive size. The fuselage was basically built around this plumbing. It was also the secret to its unmatched high-altitude performance. While German fighters were gasping for air, the Thunderbolt's engine was breathing freely. Of course, speed and altitude meant nothing without teeth. The P-47 carried 8 .50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, affectionately known as Roosevelt's piano. This arsenal could spit out over 100 rounds per second. German pilots described flying into its sights as hitting a wall of lead. A 1 or 2 second burst could literally saw the wing off an enemy plane. With up to 3,400 rounds, it could fire far longer than its cannon-armed adversaries. The final piece of the puzzle was sheer toughness. The cockpit was armored, the fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the plane's mass meant it could absorb astonishing punishment. The story of Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group became legendary. On June 26, 1943, his plane was hammered by cannon shells. His canopy was shattered, his hydraulics were gone, and his oxygen system was destroyed. Yet he regained control and limped for home, only to be attacked again. The German pilot emptied his remaining ammunition into Johnson's battered jug, then pulled alongside, no doubt expecting to see a wreck. Instead, he saw Johnson, still flying. In disbelief, the German pilot rocked his wings in a salute and flew away. While details of the story vary across historical accounts, its essence is undisputed. Johnson made it back to base, where his ground crew reportedly stopped counting after finding over 200 bullet and shrapnel holes. This was the unseen power of the Thunderbolt. The Germans saw a clumsy bottle. They failed to see the 2,000 horsepower engine, the revolutionary turbo supercharger, and an airframe that refused to die. They had made a critical mistake, and now they were about to pay for it. Section 3. The Transformation, Unleashing the Jabo. The mockery couldn't last. The key wasn't to change the plane, but to change the thinking. The man who unlocked the Thunderbolt's potential was its first and most important leader, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. Zemke was a pragmatist. He knew the P-47's weaknesses, but he also saw its overwhelming strengths. He forbade his pilots from complaining and forced them to focus on what it did best. While German pilots were luring P-47s into slow-turning fights, Zemke and his Wolfpack developed tactics that played to the Thunderbolt's advantages. They created the dive, fire, and recover doctrine, better known as boom and zoom. The concept was simple and lethal. P-47 pilots used their superior high-altitude performance to climb above the enemy. When a target was spotted, they would roll over and dive. Here, the P-47's immense weight became its greatest asset. The Jug accelerated like a falling anvil, reaching speeds over 500 miles per hour. They would scream down on a target, unleash a devastating burst from their 8.50s, and use their momentum to zoom back up to the safety of high altitude. They refused to get drawn into twisting dogfights, fighting a vertical war of speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. And the results? They were transformative. The 56th Fighter Group started racking up kills. The clumsy joke was now a lethal hunter. Zemke innovated further, creating the Zemke Fan, where his squadrons fanned out miles ahead of the bombers, acting as a sweeping net to intercept German fighters long before they could reach their targets. By August 1943, the 56th was the top air superiority group in the 8th Air Force. The top American aces in Europe, Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, David Schilling, all flew the Thunderbolt. The P-47 had proven itself as an escort fighter. But as the long-range P-51 Mustang began arriving in 1944 to take over bomber escort duties, the Thunderbolt was given a new job it was, by pure accident, born to do. Unleashed from high altitude, Thunderbolts were sent down to attack anything that moved on the ground. Its rugged airframe and air-cooled engine could absorb the flak that came with low-level attacks. Its machine guns could shred trucks and trains. The addition of underwing ordnance turned it into flying artillery. The P-47 could carry a staggering 2,500 pounds of bombs or a rack of high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs. While a full load of 10 5-inch rockets was possible on later models, it wasn't always practical, but even a partial load was devastating. This was more than half the bomb load of an earlier B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The P-47 was no longer just a fighter. It had become a jagd bomber, a Jabo. Section 4. The Nightmare, the German Experience. Starting in the spring of 1944, a new and profound terror was added to the daily life of the German Lanzer, the foot soldier. It wasn't the distant drone of high-altitude bombers. It was an intimate, personal threat that came from the sky. It was the terror of the Jabo. Jabo was German slang for Jagdbomber or fighter bomber, but the term became almost exclusively linked with the P-47. The experience was a psychological assault that began with a sound. It started as a faint, deep hum, growing into the unmistakable throaty roar of the double wasp engine. Soldiers learned to dread that sound. Then came the visual, a flight of fat-winged fighters circling arrogantly high above. They were hunting. A German officer on the Normandy front wrote, "The Jabos circle over us like hawks, looking for prey. We cannot move. We cannot light a fire. To even kick up dust is to invite death. We are trapped." When they spotted a target, a Thunderbolt would peel off and dive. This is where the sound itself became a weapon. The engine's roar would change pitch, rising into a terrifying, banshee-like scream as the massive plane plunged toward the earth. Veterans from every front described this sound with a particular horror. This psychological torment became so debilitating it earned its own name, Jabo Shrek, or Jabo fever. It was a state of constant, nerve-shredding anxiety. The sound triggered a Pavlovian response of pure panic, paralyzing units and shattering morale. When the screaming dive reached its crescendo, the final stage of the nightmare was unleashed. First came the rockets, streaks of smoke and earth-shattering explosions that could flip a tank. Immediately after, the cannons of hell, the 850 caliber machine guns. From a soldier's perspective, it was an apocalyptic storm. A 2-second burst would stitch a line of fist-sized holes across a column of trucks, turning them into fireballs. It scythed through infantry, chewed through the armor of vehicles, and turned locomotives into steaming wrecks. One German account from the Battle of the Bulge described an attack. First came the scream. We tried to run, then the rockets hit. The noise was indescribable. A Panzer near me was lifted and thrown on its side. Then the guns. It was not like gunfire. It was like a giant tearing a metal sheet. When it was over, the entire road was on fire. The pilots of the 9th Air Force became masters of this brutal work. They hunted with cold precision. They'd attack a train, not just by blowing up the tracks, but by destroying the locomotive, trapping the cars, then strafing each one until the entire train was a ruin. They turned the roads of Europe into traffic jams of death, systematically destroying every vehicle caught in between. The sound of the Thunderbolt, once a joke, had become the sound of pure terror for the German army. Section 5. The Evidence, a Trail of Carnage. The terror of the Jabo wasn't just a feeling. It was a brutal reality, written in ledgers of destruction. From D-Day to VE Day, P-47 pilots submitted claims for a level of annihilation that crippled the Wehrmacht. The numbers are hard to comprehend. In less than a year, Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars. No, that's not a typo. They claimed 9,000 locomotives, effectively strangling Germany's logistical network. Armies fight with the supplies they're given. The Thunderbolts ensured those supplies never arrived. Their wrath was famously directed at Germany's armored might. Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction of 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, from tanks to assault guns. Beyond tanks and trains, pilots claimed 68,000 trucks and other vehicles. They turned the roads of France and Germany into endless graveyards of twisted, burning metal. On one single day, April 16, 1945, Thunderbolt squadrons conducted a massive sweep against German airfields, destroying 270 enemy planes on the ground and shooting down another 29. This industrial-scale destruction was a reflection of America's own industrial might. Over 15,600 P-47s were built during the war, more than any other American fighter. For every Thunderbolt that fell to flak, 2 more were on a ship crossing the Atlantic. Its sheer survivability was another key factor. The P-47's combat loss rate was an astonishingly low 0.7% per mission. Pilots like Lieutenant Edwin Wright, who survived being hit by flak 6 separate times, flew with confidence, knowing their jug could take a beating and still bring them home. The evidence is undeniable. Official records often cite the P-47's overall aerial kill-to-loss ratio at 4.6 to 1, though figures vary depending on how losses are counted. But its true legacy was written on the ground. The derided flying milk bottle had become the Wehrmacht's most dangerous opponent, leaving behind a trail of carnage that proved, beyond any doubt, that the sound of its engine was the sound of the end. This incredible story of transformation is just one of thousands from that era. These were machines of steel and aluminum, but they were flown by men of incredible courage, and their legacies were forged in combat. If you love diving deep into the technology, the tactics, and the human stories behind history's greatest conflicts, make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell. Conclusion: the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a perfect allegory for the Allied war effort. It was underestimated, seen as too big and clumsy, a brute force solution where finesse was expected. And yet, within that brute force lay a philosophy of overwhelming power, industrial scale, and uncompromising resilience that ultimately proved decisive. The plane that Luftwaffe pilots laughed at in 1943 became the thing they feared most by 1945. It proved that a fighter didn't need to be the most nimble to win. It needed to be the most durable, the most powerful, and the most numerous. It needed to get its pilot into the fight, allow him to unleash hell, and, most importantly, bring him home to fight again. The Thunderbolt did this better than almost any other aircraft of the war. Its legacy didn't end there. That idea of a rugged, heavily armed aircraft built to survive a high-threat environment found its ultimate expression decades later in another Republic aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. The spirit of the Jug lives on. In the end, the sound of the P-47 became a weapon in its own right, breaking the morale of an army. The deep, guttural roar of its Pratt & Whitney engine became the anthem of Allied air supremacy and a funeral dirge for the Third Reich. The flying milk bottle, the clumsy dinosaur, had become a legend forged in thunder.